what's the deal with wearing continuous glucose monitors? These CGMs are little white dots that people stick in the back of their arm, and it monitors the amount of blood glucose. Now, these were made for people who've got diabetes, but it's become a real trend to wear them and monitor your blood sugars even though you don't have diabetes. In this episode, I'm going to explain why I don't think it's a good idea to manage your blood sugar levels in this way and have this much information about our health. Welcome to episode 81 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. This podcast is all for people who've got digestive issues. So why am I talking about continuous glucose monitors? Well, often my clients are very interested in managing their blood sugars due to a lot of information on social media about managing blood sugar spikes. There's influencers like the Glucose Goddess. There's also health programs like the Zoe program, which asks you to wear a blood glucose monitor for 2 weeks. And these are really influencing my clients. And so I wanted to explore it a little bit and be able to give a reference point for my take on it. And I can explain a little bit about why continuous glucose monitors aren't really necessary for people who don't have diabetes. Just to give you a reference point, I'm going to just explain a little bit about what is diabetes and then what is a problem level for your blood sugars so that we know what we're talking about. So whenever we eat food, our body breaks down the sugars, any carbohydrates, into glucose, and that is our preferred form of energy for our cells. We get glucose in our blood from eating food, and then the glucose circulates around our body, and then in order to get the glucose into the cell, we have insulin, which helps to get it across the barrier into the cell. Now, in type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where your immune cells attack the pancreas and your body doesn't make enough insulin or doesn't make any insulin. And then you have a lot more blood glucose. You have high blood glucose. Then you get type 2 diabetes as well, where either your body starts to become resistant to the insulin, or you can get insulin resistance, or your body then stops producing enough insulin in the first place. So in that case, your blood glucose level is consistently and repeatedly high, and that can lead to damage to the nerves. So if you think about, like, if you spill a bit of jam in your kitchen surfaces, anything that touches that will become sticky and thick. And that can happen to your nerves, can give problems to your kidneys. You're more at risk of cardiovascular issues like stroke and heart disease. And it just is really bad for your body to have very high blood glucose. That's why people who have diabetes take medication. They take insulin to help them get rid of this problem. And doctors can measure how much you've got in your body and how much damage has been done by checking your blood sugars. So what they will look at is your fasting blood glucose, so before you've eaten first thing in the morning, and they're looking at how much glucose is in your blood. And then they also might do an HbA1c, which is looking at your blood glucose levels over a 3-month period, because that is how long your red blood cells last. So they look at the blood cells over 3 months, and that gets your kind of average blood glucose level. And then they might also do a test where they will check your blood glucose after eating a high glucose meal. The sorts of things your doctor would look at is a fasting blood glucose level of 7 millimole per litre or more. If you've done a HbA1c test, they're looking at 6.5 or more, and those would really indicate that you have got a problem with your blood sugars. So those kind of metrics we should keep in mind as we're just going through this next little bit about blood glucose monitoring. It is normal for your blood sugars to rise after you've eaten a high sugary meal. If you've eaten a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugars, then it's normal for your blood sugars to go up and even into this level and then to come back down again. But what we're looking for is that your blood sugars return to normal within 2 hours. So that is a normal response to a normal meal and not anything that we should be pathologizing. Obviously, eating a healthy diet that's not full of loads of sugar, that you are getting a balance of nutrients, fats, proteins, fibre, all of these things really, really important still. But it's okay if your blood glucose level goes up as long as it comes back down quickly. That is how your body responds to glucose, and that is what your body is meant to do. There are some people online, and there's people like the glucose goddess, who keep telling people that their blood glucose level should be as small as possible. And at the moment, we don't really have the evidence that says lower is better. As long as your body is getting your blood glucose level back down again within that 2-hour period after eating, it's okay. So it's normal for you to get an increase in your blood sugars within the first 20 to 90 minutes after eating. And there's a real difference between this, what they might describe as a blood glucose spike or a sugar spike, and I've seen that in a number of social media posts, that people are being told to lower their blood glucose even if it's within a normal range, that this is something that we have to manage. And I think this is where the problem is, that we're trying to micromanage a normal physiological process in our body that doesn't need micromanaging. And by the way, there isn't a clear medical definition of what is meant by glucose spike. So this isn't a medical term, and we don't really know what that means. A continuous glucose monitor is a little device, you've probably seen them, people stick in their back of their arm, and it measures the amount of blood in your arm, in the tissues in your arm. And there's a slight difference between measuring the blood from your veins that your doctor will do and the blood in the plasma, but it's, a small difference, and there's definitely a timing difference to that as well. But purposes of what we're talking about here today, a blood glucose monitor effectively is just measuring how much glucose is in your blood all the time, and it takes it either at like 5-minute intervals, maybe 1 minute, or maybe even 10-minute intervals, and updates you on a little app on your phone. People who've got diabetes, this is incredible. Like, it's giving them the tools to be able to manage it without worrying too much about glucose dips and going in hypoglycemic. Problem is that a lot of people who are using these now don't have diabetes, but they're using them to optimize their health, to tweak it and to micromanage it, as I was saying. A problem level would be your blood glucose level staying at over 7.8 millimoles per litre after 2 hours of a big glucose meal. That means your body is not clearing it. It is keeping it really high for 2 hours. But it doesn't mean that you should always avoid your blood glucose ever getting to that point. It just means it shouldn't stay there. It doesn't mean that you can't ever get a higher blood glucose reading. And that is some of the problem when we're looking at this information that ordinarily we wouldn't know. We wouldn't see our blood glucose rising, and you normally can't feel it. And so it's giving you an additional level of data that we don't often have. If you are thinking about how to control your blood sugars, then the kind of things that you might want to take note of is how big was your blood glucose spike? How high does it go after every meal that you eat? Is it consistently rising above 7.8 or like 10 millimole per litre? But at the moment, for people who are not diabetic, we don't really have good consistent data about what is good or bad. Most research says that yes, your body should come down again 1 to 2 hours after eating, going up is normal, but that spikes over about 11.1 millimole per litre are typically considered quite excessive. But we don't actually know from non-diabetic people, is this a problem? Like, how many of these is considered bad? What does it mean if you have 1 spike per day? What about 1 spike per week? Should you be really trying to bring that down, or is it a problem? So we think that this level of data sometimes is helpful to know, but it actually can increase a lot of anxiety about food. And that is one of the things I want to come on to, is actually what are we looking for and what are we hoping to find with this information. There are some things that influence our blood glucose response to food when we don't have diabetes that people might not be aware of, and you can get quite caught up in looking at the data from your continuous glucose monitor as a non-diabetic and maybe getting confused about the information and getting extra worried about what might be happening. Firstly, your blood sugar responses are meant to change throughout the day. Most people have a better response to foods they eat earlier in the day, and as we go through the day, our blood sugar response becomes worse. So the same meal eaten at the same time might have a different blood glucose response in the same people. And I've actually got some studies that I can link to in the show notes that show that people eating the same meal at 8 a.m, 8 p.m, and midnight had different responses to the same meal. So this shows that meal timing has got an effect on your glucose metabolism. Even if you're eating the same food at each meal, when you're eating the food might have a response. What you might find is if you're tracking using a CGM, you might find that you think, oh God, I've eaten this food and like sweet potatoes have really messed up my blood sugars. Like I shouldn't be having sweet potato. But actually, is it the time of day that you've eaten it? Also, blood sugar response can be affected by other meals you've eaten earlier in the day. So we can't predict what your blood sugar response will be to a certain foods based on what you've eaten, because the timing of it makes a difference. Also, we rarely eat just one particular food on its own. Most meals are mixed foods, which include protein, fats and fibres, and a meal itself is the thing that causes your blood glucose to change rather than just one particular food. Which is again why it's impossible to make predictions about what you can and can't eat based on data just from the glucose monitor. It doesn't really make sense. The other thing that can definitely affect your results is exercise. However active you are, it will affect your response to food that you eat. Now, overall, generally, exercise improves your insulin sensitivity. So that means you get more efficient at packing away the glucose, your blood sugar levels will drop or will not rise as high. But actually, in intense exercise, like if you're doing high intensity exercise, in the short term, your blood glucose levels can go up. So you might see your blood glucose levels going up when you're exercising and think, oh, like I'm doing the right thing. Why is it going up? But actually, it's part of your body's way of releasing that energy. So you're getting more glucose in your blood in order to fuel your activity. And then after the exercise, your blood glucose response would be lower for 1 to 2 days. And this is, I've got another research study I can link to here. The research participants did 40 minutes of really intense exercise and their blood glucose response was lower for 1 to 2 days. And this was people who had diabetes and people who didn't. So you may find that your response to certain foods was better the day after you did your CrossFit training or you did a run. And then another day you might eat the same food, but you haven't exercised for a couple of days before. And then your blood sugars go up a lot more after eating that same meal. And it's nothing to do with the food, it's to do with your exercise. So that's another reason why you cannot predict the foods that are going to be good for your blood glucose, because it's so many different things that impact it. Another reason why CGMs aren't great for people who don't have diabetes is that because they've been calibrated and set up for people who do have diabetes, we're not quite sure if they are accurate at reading the data, especially at the lower end of the scale. So if you're mostly staying in range or going under, we don't actually know whether it is 100% accurate. And there are studies that show that there is a difference in the readings from a CGM to blood drawn from your veins. There's actually a 13% difference in one study from 2022, and the researchers used different meal combinations and then tested the blood glucose with the CGM readings, and then they took blood draw from the veins, and these was in healthy adults. And the CGMs underestimated the amount of time that people were spending in a normal range of blood glucose. And then sometimes we also have data that show different CGMs show different results in the same people at the same time. So another study took 16 healthy people and fitted them with 2 different CGMs to track their measurements over 4 weeks. And they were in an inpatient study, so they were being monitored all the time. The 2 CGMs showed different measurements. And in addition, there were differences in the same person eating the same meal from 1 week to the next. And this just shows it would be so hard to make any judgments about how your body will respond to food, because they couldn't replicate the same glucose response in the same person in the same meal. They had different responses. And actually, I wanted to just highlight what some of the researchers said at the end of this study. They said, Misclassifying meals or foods as good or bad in terms of their CGM response may affect overall eating behaviours with potentially deleterious consequences, which is what I think is one of the main problems, is you would read that data and think, oh my God, like my blood sugars shot up when I ate that food. I shouldn't have that again. But actually, unless you can replicate it every single time with eating this same food, you can't draw that conclusion from this data. So there's just a whole range of things that show it's not accurate and it's not reproducible, which is one of the tests of good science, basically. You should be able to reproduce the effects. What the main problem with this is, and I've seen this in my clients, is that it gives you a lot of stress, anxiety and worry about what you're eating because you can't feel your blood sugars going up. But when you see this data of it spiralling out of control and shooting up into the red, then it feels very worrying. I've seen reports from personalised nutrition programs like Zoe saying you've got poor blood sugar control in response to eating their standardised muffin. But when I looked at the data, they had a perfectly normal glucose response to eating a food. It had gone up and then it had gone back down again. But this client had so much worry about whether they were causing inflammation and lasting damage with their eating pattern, which was already very healthy. And what I worry about is this money could be spent on other things, like we are all free to spend our money on whatever we want, of course, but CGMs are quite expensive. And if you don't really need it, maybe you could spend your money on a nice meal out with your family, going on a weekend away. Like there are all kinds of things you could be spending that money on. The next issue that I see is that if you're just focusing on your blood glucose, you might be missing other issues with your health. Why are you not so concerned about your cholesterol levels or your blood pressure or your triglycerides? Like if you're only monitoring your blood glucose and you're trying to minimise every blood glucose rise, then you might be changing your eating pattern to a way that's actually not that healthy overall. So for example, you might notice if you eat a higher fat meal, your blood sugar spike is lower. So therefore you might choose higher fat meals from now on. And over time, this could have an effect on your weight, your blood lipid levels, or your nutrient intake. You might also start avoiding foods like fruit because they spike your blood sugars as per the data. And so it's making choices for you based on inaccurate data, but also data that is only one part of the picture. Your blood glucose profile is important, especially if you're in that pre-diabetic range. However, it's also important to manage your cholesterol level, to have good muscle mass. These things are also really important, but we don't give it as much attention. When you are outsourcing your body sensing to a device, you are missing a way to connect with how you're feeling. So I feel a bit the same about people who are tracking their sleep with a Fitbit or a smartwatch, because people can wake up and think, oh, I feel all right. But then they look at their watch and they're like, oh, I actually had a terrible night's sleep. And it brings you down. It makes you feel more tired. It makes you feel like actually things aren't going so well. So instead of thinking about how we're feeling, how our brain is working, how our digestion's working, we're relying on data from a device. And as I've said, it's just one part of the picture. Thinking about how we feel and how our body is operating is more effective than just looking at the data. What I see in my clients is quite a lot of fear about food, that, oh, I had oats and my blood sugars went up, so I need to avoid them. I can't eat oats. And this, I think, is the wrong conclusion to jump to from information such as this, because you're basing your food choices on this device, which, as I've tried to highlight, CGMs aren't good at reproducing the same results. So the same person eating the same meal from one week to the next will have different blood sugar profiles. And if we can't replicate the results, then we shouldn't automatically rule foods in or out based on that data. And anyway, even if foods do spike your blood sugars, as long as they come down again, there's no issue. Even if they were giving you a bad response, or what we might consider a bad response, then it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you, and you don't necessarily need to avoid those foods. The reason I think maybe you're drawn to programs like this, which is giving you information, it's giving you data, and I have the same kind of conversations with people who are keen to do a stool test, is they want more information because they feel really bad. And I completely understand where it's coming from for people to wish that they had more information, they had the answer. I do really empathise with this kind of drive to find the root cause of your problem. It's unlikely to be your blood sugars unless your doctor has asked you to do a diabetes test and you're in that pre-diabetic range. Then yeah, sure, there are things that need to be done to your diet and your lifestyle. The majority of people who are doing this programme are not in that range and are still looking for answers for why they don't feel good. And I think probably a more holistic, personalised approach is what will help. And I know these programs are called personalised nutrition programs, but they are using algorithms and a small section of your biological data to make decisions about and giving you instructions for what to eat. So I think just be very careful about information that you're taking from an algorithm. Just be conscious that it's not necessarily giving you the whole picture. I'm going to record a little bonus episode which will share some of the highlights of my experience of wearing a continuous glucose monitor for 2 weeks as preparation for recording this episode. I wanted to see what it was like and be able to talk about the realities of it from my own experience. So look out for that coming up next. But yes, we'll leave it there for this week. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.